class, welcome back to World History 2. I hope you're all doing well today. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at how the Europeans moved away from the European continent and began what is called the Age of Exploration. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint.
Okay, class, we're now going to move into the PowerPoint portion of this lecture on exploration part 1. Okay, so motives to explore. Why is it that there was a need to explore? Well, during the Renaissance time period, it was just an idea of just expanding out. And when they began to expand out, there was just a focus on fresh lands that had valuable resources that the explorers could go and exploit and bring back to their homeland and be able to trade. And there was obviously some sort of a wealth involved with all of this. So the need to explore was because of a desire to explore fresh lands for resources. And trade with Asia and African lands, that had been going on. That was not foreign. Definitely one of the results of the Crusades was an increase in trade because of the routes that the Europeans took to go down to the Holy Land. But a trade in Asia and African land with African lands that had existed before this. It was just that now with exploration, it was more over the sea lanes instead of over the land routes. And they would definitely be focusing on spices and silks and gold and ivory, just different resources that these other lands had that an explorer could go and gain and then bring back to their land and then gain wealth because of it. But also there was a missionary activity that takes place, mainly through the Catholic Church at the beginning, because explorers went out and found new lands. The Catholic Church would not be far behind, and so missionaries would then go, and they would look at new people groups in these new lands to evangelize and bring the Bible to, and the church would then begin to also push for exploration. And definitely after an explorer made landfall and maybe a footprint there in the new lands, the church would then say, oh, we can go there now and we can evangelize these people groups. And that would be the Catholic Church that I'm talking about. There were also some maritime advances that assisted in exploration. First off, the ships. There were better ships during this time period, and also better sailing methods based on two types of sails that were now being used. There were square sails and triangular sails, and they were used in combination with each other, which were very effective, and they could harness the wind and move larger and larger ships with more and more sails. Square sails, for the most part, being on the center of the ship along the masts, and then triangular sails that would be more out on the outskirts of the ship and maybe in the front, and they could catch wind that way. Also, there was better instrumentation because of the development of the magnetic compass, and they would be able to move about the sea lanes more accurately. They would also use the winds and currents to their advantage. One of the ways they did it was called volta de mar, which means return through the seas. And this was a sailing technique developed by the Portuguese, where the ship would use favorable winds to go around contrary winds. So during different parts of the year, the wind patterns might not be very good to get back to, let's say, their homeland. And they would go, if they would go a straight route, let's say, back to their homeland, they may hit winds that are not favorable, maybe pushing them away or just not good for sailing. And so what they would do is they would go into a different wind pattern that was more advantageous. So they would use these favorable winds to go around the contrary winds. So the trip may actually be longer in, let's say, nautical miles. It might be a longer distance, but it would be faster because they wouldn't have to deal with contrary winds. So they would go around these winds. And that was a development that takes place during this time of exploration, which allowed the ships to really get around and explore. Okay, so now we're going to look at a few explorers here. We're just going to get some big names here. We're not going to look at every single explorer of the Renaissance time period, but these are definitely the big ones. The first one is Vasco da Gama. And I'm sure you've heard of these explorers that we're going to be mentioning, but Vasco da Gama, 1460 to 1524, he was commissioned by the King of Portugal to find a sea route from Portugal to India. And he was actually the first European to reach India by sea. Before this, they would go to India and they would trade, but it was over land routes. It would take quite a long time. but he was the first one to reach India by sea. And he opened trade with Asia through these sea lanes. He set up a yearly spice trade armada, allowing direct trade between India and Portugal. So there was basically a planned sailing pattern to have ships going back and forth, bringing the spices and to Europe, and then taking whatever goods they're going to trade or finances that they're going to trade or give to India. And so there was this this kind of trade route armada going back and forth. And he paved the way for England and the Dutch to enter the Indian Ocean. He was commissioned by Portugal, but later on the English and Dutch would move in, and it would be the Dutch East India Company would be the main trading company there, and then the English would come in, and it would be the British East India Trading Company. And so the English and the Dutch would then enter in and become primary players in the Indian Ocean. There's a picture of Da Gama on the left, and then you can see a trade route. This is just a map that I borrowed off the internet, and you can see leading Portugal up here, and then moving down, and you know stopping at different islands. It wouldn't be just a direct sailing. They would stop along the coast of Africa and get supplies and obviously trade there. You can see Mozambique and moving up, and then going over to India, and then returning. So there would be an armada going back and forth between Portugal and India. Okay, the next explorer we're going to look at is Prince Henry the Navigator, 1394 to 1460. He's the third surviving son of King John I and Philippa of Portugal. And basically what he did was, it wasn't so much in regards to a sailor himself, but he sponsored exploration of the west coast of Africa. And he helped found the University of Lisbon and had a push for maritime advancement. And he supervised the building of a new type of ship. And the ship is called the Caravel, which was much lighter and faster, and it handled very well in rough currents along the coast of Africa. So he was integral in the exploration of the west coast of Africa, and definitely whatever resources were there would be through trading stations along the west coast of Africa. So here's a painting of him, and then you can see his routes, or at least the routes that were taken based on his sponsorship from Portugal. And you can see going down the west coast of Africa here, coming around, and then there will be different trading spots, and then moving back to Portugal. So he was definitely integral in the exploration of the west portions of Africa. And then we get to the most well-known probably explorer, Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506. And he believed he could find a shorter route to India and China by sailing west. So leaving Europe, he would travel west. Instead of going around Africa, he believed he could go west and just go and come to India that way. Well, Portugal would not finance this trip. They're like, no, we're not going to do it. So he goes to another country. He goes next door to Spain. And he has King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain fund that exploration. And of course, we know this from probably studying history all the way back to when we were kids in history class in elementary school. But in 1492, Columbus sails with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And after 5 weeks of sailing west, he lands in the Caribbean on October 12, 1492. And what he did, he didn't find a route to India. He found a route to new lands. The New World is what we call it, and that is the discovery of America. This is basically an event that ignited exploration of the American continents. Now that's plural because it's going to be an exploration of South America, Central America, and North America. Now, of course, earlier than this, there were some exploration by northern Baltic peoples, such as the Vikings, and going to Iceland and all of that. But for the most part, and most well known, is Christopher Columbus's founding of America, or the New World. So here's a very famous painting of him. Here's the route that he took. So he leaves here and moves on down and then to the Canary Islands, and then he crosses the Atlantic Ocean and he lands in the Caribbean. He moves along the top of Cuba and what is called Hispaniola, and which is today, that's where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are. And then he moves his way back. He lands in the Azores, and then he goes back to Spain. And he basically then says, I've discovered this new world. Here's just a blow up of where he landed on October 12th here in, basically it's one of the islands of the Bahamas, and then sails along here and then heads back. So that's just a map of his first voyage. Okay, so following this, Ferdinand Magellan, 1480 to 1521, he follows Columbus's idea and sails west for the route to India. And he departs September 1519, and he actually goes around the tip of South America and landed in Guam in March of 1520. He continued to the Philippines. So he basically goes around the New World, and when he lands in the Philippines, he's actually killed by the indigenous people on a Philippine island. But the ship continues, and it returns to Spain through what is now the familiar Indian Ocean, because there had been trade going on in the Indian Ocean. So they've moved into the Indian Ocean, and then they continued around the tip of Africa and then head back to Europe. So Magellan is the one that has circumnavigated the world, or his ships were. He's killed in the Philippines. It was a difficult voyage. They lacked food for a lot of the voyage. They lacked fruits and vegetables. Many of them got what is called scurvy, which is an illness when you don't have vitamin C. You're not getting enough nutrients from fruits and vegetables, so you get this illness called scurvy, where you lose weight, you become gaunt, your gums can bleed. It's just a nasty illness. So it was a difficult voyage, but his ships were the first to circumnavigate the world. There's a picture of Magellan, and then here's a map of Magellan's voyage. So he left Spain, he comes around the tip of South America, and that is called the Strait of Magellan, in the tip of South America. There's a little waterway, and so you go through this little waterway, which is called the Strait of Magellan. Then he crosses the Pacific Ocean, and then over here in the Philippines, April 27, 1521, Magellan is killed on the Philippines. They continue on through some of the islands, move across the Indian Ocean, and then move back south of Africa, and then back to Spain. So he circumnavigates the world, or his ships. Now we're going to move on to this explorer, Captain James Cook, 1728 to 1779. So we're actually moving out of the Renaissance time here. This is a later explorer, but we do need to mention him because of what he contributed to exploration. He's a British naval officer and also an expert map maker. And he made 3 journeys to the Pacific Ocean and definitely mapped a lot of the Pacific Ocean. He was looking for a Northwest Passage, and he was also the first European to set foot on the Hawaiian Islands. Unfortunately for him, when he was on Hawaii, he was killed by the indigenous Hawaiians. So he was another European that was killed in the Pacific. There's a picture of him. And then his map here, so you can draw this in your notes and memorize it for the exam. And you can see what he did. Now, I'm just kidding with that. You do not need to know this route. This is just for information to show what he did. But you can see on the top right where he left Plymouth, England, and that's where he begins. And you can see how he went. The first voyage, which is the red line, the red arrow, he actually went down underneath of South Africa. Now, he didn't go through the Strait of Magellan. He went around what is called Cape Horn, which is the southern portion of South America. And then he goes over here into the Pacific, goes along and finds his way to New Zealand and skirts up here to Australia, and then comes back under the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern tip of Africa, and then back up to England. But then his other journeys, he goes down and he goes the opposite way, and he goes under Africa, and he skirts along down in through here, his other journeys. He actually goes up here in his third journey along North America, Alaska. He goes up through Alaska and finds this Northwest Passage, and then comes back down and then ends up on the Hawaiian Islands where he's killed. Now, this Northwest Passage he found between Alaska and Russia, which at the time, Siberia, through the Bering Sea. But then he just turns around and comes back. Of course, there's an ice cap at the top of the globe, and so he would not have been able to go over the top of the globe because of the ice cap. But he turned around and came back to Hawaii, where he ends up losing his life. Okay, so that is it for exploration part 1. I'll see you in a second.
All right, class, that's it for today. Next time, we're going to move into exploration part 2. See you then.